Hi guys, welcome back to Codemaster Coach, your medical coding tutor. Guys, we're continuing our review of the official ICD-10-CM coding guidelines for 2025. Guys, chapter 19 is a very large chapter, so it's going to take at least 2 videos to complete this. But on chapter 19, we're talking about injury, poisonings, and certain other consequences of external causes. These codes can be found between S00 and T88. A talks about the application of the 7th character in chapter 19. We're going to see how this 7th character can truly grow in ICD-10-CM. So it says most categories in chapter 19 have a 7th character requirement for each applicable code. Most categories in this chapter have 3 7th character values, with the exception of fractures. A stands for initial encounter, D stands for subsequent encounter, and S stands for sequela. Categories for traumatic fractures have additional 7th character values. While the patient may be seen by a new or different provider over the course of treatment for an injury, assignment of the 7th character is based on whether the patient is undergoing active treatment and not whether the provider is seeing the patient for the first time. Guys, that's vital. Let me say that again. While the patient may be seen by a new or different provider over the course of treatment for an injury, assignment of the 7th character is based on whether the patient is undergoing active treatment and not whether the provider is seeing the patient for the first time. It goes on to say, for complication codes, active treatment refers to treatment for the condition described by the code, even though it may be related to an earlier precipitating problem. And it gave an example. Code T84.50XA is a code for infection and inflammatory reaction due to unspecified internal joint prosthesis. The A stands for the initial encounter, and it is used when active treatment is provided for the infection, even though the condition relates to the prosthetic device, implant, or graft that was placed at a previous encounter. So this is the initial encounter for the infection that the patient got from this internal prosthesis. The 7th character A, initial encounter, is used for each encounter where the patient is receiving active treatment for the condition. 7th character D, subsequent encounter, is used for encounters after the patient has completed active treatment of the condition and is receiving routine care for the condition during the healing or recovery phase. Now note, the aftercare Z codes should not be used for aftercare for conditions such as injuries or poisonings, where the 7th character are provided to identify subsequent care. So guys, I put a note in my guidelines in my book that state aftercare Z codes should not be used for injuries or poisonings. That's important. For example, the aftercare of an injury, you're supposed to assign the acute injury code with the 7th character D for subsequent encounter. Okay, so you notice it's saying here, if it's an injury or a poisoning, where we would normally think go to aftercare codes. No, this is an aftercare for injury or poisoning, so you're going to use the active or the acute injury code, but on your 7th character, use a D instead. And it says 7th character S for sequela is for use for complications or conditions that arise as a direct result of a condition such as a scar formation after a burn. The scars are sequela of a burn. I always tell my students a sequela is anything that's a result of. Had it not been for the burn, there would not be a scar today. So the scars are sequela of the burn. When using seventh character S, it is necessary to use both the injury code that precipitated the sequela and the code for the sequela itself. So you're going to identify the fact that today they're coming in for that scar, but you're also going to identify the fact that they had a previous burn. The S is added only to the injury code, not the sequela code. So again, the scar today is not the sequela. It is the sequela, but you're not going to identify the scar today with the seventh character S. You're going to identify the fact that they had a burn previously. Therefore, the burn code needs the S for sequela, because they don't have that burn today. They have that scar today. And it says the seventh character S identifies the injury responsible for the sequela. And then the specific type of sequela, such as the scar, is sequenced first, followed by the injury code. Now let me check my outline, make sure I covered everything I wanted to cover for A, application of a seventh character in chapter 19. And what I did is I made a copy of the code book so that I could show you how the seventh character, this is between S00 and T88, which is what we're discussing now. Your seventh character can be A, D, or S, but we're going to see where it can be A, D, G, K, P, or S. And we're going to also see today how it can even go as far as A, seventh character, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, J, K, M, N, P, Q, R, or S. So these seventh characters are really going to grow in this section of ICD-10-CM. All right, let's keep going. So again, my note for A just says, remember the initial encounter in ICD-10-CM does not stand for first visit. It stands for active treatment. All right, we're down to B, coding of injuries. Let's go to the guidelines. B, coding of injuries. When coding injuries, assign separate codes for each injury unless a combination code is provided, in which case the combination code is assigned. So our goal here is to make sure we identify each injury. It says codes from category T07, unspecified multiple injuries, should not be assigned in the inpatient setting unless information for a more specific code is not available. Let me go back to that. Codes from category T07, unspecified multiple injuries, should not be assigned in the inpatient setting. Guys, the patient is there 24 hours a day on the inpatient setting. There is no excuse for using an unspecified multiple injuries code, because with them being there inpatient, there's time to find all of the injuries. So again, the unspecified multiple injuries code T07 should not be assigned in the inpatient setting unless information for a more specific code is just not available. And then traumatic injury codes S00 through T149 are not to be used for normal healing surgical wounds or to identify complications of surgical wounds. The code for the most serious injury, as determined by the provider and the focus of treatment, is sequenced first. And that's kind of our rule with all coding. We always put our more serious or resource-consuming condition first. Okay? Then it goes into superficial. Guys, don't make the mistake I made. When I first learned the code, I was after the outpatient physician office setting, I went to the emergency room to code. And I would get ER visits that said patient was coming in from a motor vehicle accident with multiple superficial injuries. And I was thinking, oh my gosh, the patient is going to die. They've got bad injuries. Guys, superficial injuries are small little top surface injuries. It says superficial injuries such as abrasions or contusions are not coded when associated with more severe injuries of the same site. So again, if you've got contusions and abrasions as well as maybe a complex laceration, which means it's really deep, a really deep cut, then don't code the superficial, code the more intense, the more severe injury of that same site instead. Because the understanding is when you treat that more severe injury, it's going to take care of the abrasions or the contusions. And number 2 says primary injury with damage to nerve and blood vessels. Let me make sure my outline didn't say anything for number 1. Nope, 1, 2, and 3 are straight from the guidelines. So let's go back. Number 2, primary injury with damage to nerves and blood vessels. When a primary injury results in minor damage to peripheral nerves or blood vessels, the primary injury is sequenced first, with additional codes for injuries to nerves and spinal cords, such as category S04, and or injury to a blood vessel, such as category S15. When the primary injury is to the blood vessels or nerves, that injury should be sequenced first. Because the mindset is anytime you're on the top layer, that's superficial. But when you get down further into the nerves and the blood vessels, those should be sequenced first. Now, iatrogenic injuries, remember, iatrogenic is unknown cause. We don't know, or caused by a physician stepping in if he just left it alone and let it heal. But iatrogenic injury codes from Chapter 19 should not be assigned for injuries that occur during or as a result of medical intervention. So again, iatrogenic injuries are the result of medical intervention. Assign the appropriate complication code. So it becomes a complication, not just a regular injury when it's due to or the result of medical intervention. And encoding of traumatic fractures. First thing you need to do here is under the main term trauma or fractures. Main term traumatic fractures or fractures in your alphabetic index. Notice the difference between, there's 2 types, pathologic fracture and traumatic fracture. And I remind my students that a pathological fracture is a fracture that's a result from other conditions. Other disease processes have, like osteoporosis, weakens a bone and causes it to be brittle. Traumatic fractures are fractures due to some type of trauma. So it says here, for coding of traumatic fractures, the principle of multiple coding of injuries should be followed in coding of fractures. Fractures of specified sites are coded individually by site in accordance with both the provisions within the categories S02, S12, S22, S32, S42, S49, S52, S59, S62, S72, S79, S82, S89, S92, and the level of detail furnished by the medical record content. So carry it all the way out, identifying left or right or bilateral as those category codes expand. It says a fracture not indicated as open or closed should be coded to closed. A fracture not indicated whether displaced or not displaced should be coded to displaced. So I would put a note in my code book. If the doctor doesn't tell you if the fracture is open or closed, then code it, the default is closed. If he doesn't indicate if the fracture is displaced or not, the default is displaced. All right. Yep, that's all of them. All right, now we're down to coding of traumatic fractures. Oh, those are the ones we just covered. Okay, let me make sure we covered them all. Yep. And then the more specific guidelines. And I love this because it goes straight to what we just said. Your guidelines reiterates it right here. More specific guidelines are as follows. Initial versus subsequent encounters for fractures. Traumatic fractures are coded using the appropriate 7th character for initial encounter for A, B, or C. Because remember on those other ones where I showed you how we have even more seventh characters than just A, D, and S. So for the initial A, B, or C, for each encounter where the patient is receiving active treatment for the fracture, the appropriate seventh character for initial encounter should also be assigned for a patient who delayed seeking treatment for the fracture or non-union. So what that's saying here is, if you cut your finger, and I've known patients that have thought that if they could just run it under cold water, it would eventually stop bleeding, and they just wrapped it, but a week or two later they're noticing it's not healing. And it's not going to heal because it's too deep of a cut that it needs some internal repairs along with the external repairs. So even if they wait 2 weeks to come in, if it's still for the initial encounter and they're still receiving active treatment, it's going to be a seventh character, A, B, or C. Now it says fractures are coded using the appropriate seventh character for subsequent care for encounters after the patient has completed active treatment of the fracture and is receiving routine care for the fracture during the healing or recovery phase. And then care for complications of surgical treatment for fracture repairs during the healing or recovery phase should be coded with the appropriate complication codes. So when there's a complication, don't go under fracture, go to main term complication, and then find whatever your surgical treatment that was rendered for the fracture, cover it there under main term complication. Care of complication of fractures, such as a malunion or non-union, should be reported with the appropriate seventh character for subsequent care with non-union K, M, and N. So, or subsequent care for malunion P, Q, and R. So see how your seventh characters are expanding to what I showed you on that other copy of the code book, where the seventh characters just went from 3, then it went to 5. Now it's got all these other seventh characters, because look at the complication. There was a malunion or a non-union of the bones coming back together. Therefore, your seventh character could be K, M, or N. In malunion and non-union, it says the appropriate seventh character for initial encounter should also be assigned for a patient who delayed seeking treatment for the fracture or non-union. Again, same thing we said up here about the patient that waited to come in thinking they were going to treat it themselves, and they realized they can't treat it themselves. So when it doesn't join back together on its own, and this is their initial encounter, then you need to use the appropriate seventh character for initial for treatment of the fracture or the non-union. Now the open fracture designation in the assignment of the seventh character for fractures of the forearm, femur, and lower leg, including ankle, are based on Gustillo's open fracture classification. And when the Gustillo classification type is not specified for an open fracture, then the seventh character for open fracture type 1 or type 2 should be assigned. And that's where your seventh character B, E, H, M, or Q come into play. It says a code from category M80, not a traumatic fracture, should be used for any patient with known osteoporosis who suffers a fracture, even if the patient had a minor fall or trauma, if that fall or trauma would not usually break a normal healthy bone. So again here, this is where the pathological fracture comes into play. And remember, again, pathological is when the patient has some other disease process, such as osteoporosis, that weakens the bones to a point that even when this patient suffers a minor fall or trauma, you'd think to go to traumatic fracture, but this is saying that even a healthy normal bone would not normally break. But because this patient has osteoporosis, this fracture is not a traumatic fracture, but a pathologic fracture. And you should be at the M80 category and not at the S category. Okay. The aftercare Z codes should not be used for aftercare for traumatic fractures. For aftercare of a traumatic fracture, Assign the acute fracture code with the appropriate 7th character. Now this is really important because I'm tempted a lot of times to go to that aftercare Z code for fractures, but you do not remember, you don't do it for fractures or injuries. You're going to code it with the acute code, but identify the 7th character that identifies that is aftercare and not initial and not a Z code for aftercare codes. All right, let's see if we got everything for number 1. Yeah, I just put a note here. We're going to talk about physiofracture data, so let's go there first on the guidelines. Multiple fractures sequencing. Multiple fractures are sequenced in accordance with the severity of the fracture. So again, when you have multiple fractures, more than one site, you have your arm, your leg, wherever, then they identify the different bones. The one with the most severe fracture is going to be coded first. Your most resource-consuming fracture should be coded first. So that's your sequencing. And then for a physiofracture, it says assign only the code identifying the type of physiofracture. Do not assign a separate code to identify the specific bone that is fractured. And I went in and I had to make sure I identified what a physiofracture is. It's also called Salter-Harris fractures. So if you see Salter-Harris fractures, that's the same thing. There are important childhood fractures that involve the physis, which is physio or the growth plate. The bone is still growing. They are relatively common and important to differentiate from other injuries because the involvement of the physis may cause premature closure, resulting in limb shortening and abnormal growth. So just know physiofractures, even on your guidelines, it just states they are assigned to the code identifying the type of physiofracture. And don't assign a separate code to identify the specific bone that is fractured. Okay guys, we're going to stop here so this videos don't get so long. I'm coming right back tomorrow and we're going to start talking about coding of burns and corrosions. Thanks guys, I'll be right back. Thanks.